Over the years, Xbox has put a major emphasis on their Game Pass subscription model. It's probably the most unique subscription service in gaming right now thanks to its consistent day one catalog, and it's that reason that it's just so often viewed as the best deal in gaming. I mean, it seems like every other week, whether it be big or small, there's always a new game to look forward to. But with so many great games, the question is which game should you start out with first? And, well, that's what this video will tackle today. We're going to take a look at 25 of the best games that Game Pass has to offer. Now, this list is only my opinion, and as always, when it comes to these Game Pass videos, I decided not to include Halo, Gears, and Forza, not because they're not great games, because they're actually pretty amazing, but instead it's because I want to highlight other games besides just their staple franchises. I mean, most Xbox fans already know that these franchises are absolutely top tier, but with that said, let's just go and jump right into it. Number 25, and to kick things off, from the makers of Fallout New Vegas, Obsidian surprisingly made a great survival game with RPG elements being grounded. This was a completely unexpected project from them, but they managed to pull it off. And like a lot of other survival games in the market, there's an actual story in Grounded. So, it's got all the survival elements that you would expect. You can craft, scavenge, and explore in its larger-than-life backyard, but there is an actual end. So if you like survival games, but if you want a more focused adventure, then Grounded is a great game to play, and plus it also makes for a great cooperative experience. Number 24, Tales of Arise. Now, Xbox isn't exactly known to be the best place to play Japanese games, but I think they've really stepped up to the plate with their Game Pass offering, and that includes one of this generation's better action RPGs. Tales of Arise is a beautiful JRPG. It's a lot of fun to play, and on top of that, it also has a well-told story. It's about a slave that feels no pain, and he meets up with this more privileged woman that is just kind of the polar opposite of him. She instead inflicts pain when she's touched. So this contrast between the two main characters really makes for this interesting dynamic, and it only gets more engaging as their adventure unfolds and other characters join in their party. Number 23, Humanity. Now, for you puzzle fans out there, here's a unique one being Humanity. It's almost kind of this mixture of Lemmings with some of the Ratchet & Clank A Crack in Time puzzles, if you ever played either one of those games. Basically, though, you play as a dog that guides these people to their destination. And there's some platforming involved, but, more or less, you just kind of tell them to go left, right, forward, and it all sounds simple on the surface. But where it gets really interesting is that they introduce unique properties to completely change how you would think about a traditional obstacle. I mean, if anything else, I think it's a clever game that also has outstanding music to vibe to. Number 22, Remnant 2. What if you made a Souls game into a third-person shooter? Well, that's pretty much what Remnant 2 is. It's a class-based shooter with Souls-like combat, and that might sound strange, but surprisingly, it's actually a brilliant combination. As you would expect from Souls-like, it can offer a lot of challenge, but what I really like about Remnant 2 is that it takes a popular genre and it turns it into its own thing. It's inspired, but it's not a clone either because it can completely stand on its own. And there's just so much to do in this game. There's a lot of worlds to explore, and there's a diverse set of enemies. It does a great job at keeping you on your toes, and even better here is that Remnant 2 makes for one of the better cooperative experiences that you can play. Number 21, Palworld. Of course, we have to talk about one of the biggest surprises this generation. Palworld absolutely took the world by storm, reaching more than 25 million players. Pretty impressive, but a part of that is because at first glance, you might be fooled into thinking that Palworld is just Pokemon with guns. And hey, that sounds bizarre, but its gameplay is actually very different. This is actually more of a survival game than anything else. I think a better comparison would probably be Ark Survival Evolved with monster taming elements. You can capture monsters, you can train them and battle them, but you can also build up your own base and farm to your heart's desire. However, do keep in mind that this is an early access title, so it's not necessarily perfect. They are still working to improve Palworld even more, but for what it is, it's a relatively fun experience with a lot of potential to grow over time. Number 20, A Plague Tale Requiem. Now, if you're looking for a good story-driven narrative experience, then this here would be one of the first games to try out. It has this really unique setting and atmosphere. It's set in a rat-infested world driven by a plague, and you play as two younger kids just simply trying to survive. And because of that, its gameplay focuses more on stealth-based elements. And I think this is a game that perfectly displays why this genre can be just so thrilling. You have to be cunning with your every move, and they did a good job at tying its gameplay to its characters and world. And when you combine that with its engaging story, I mean, there's just not many games that does it better than A Plague Tale: Requiem. Number 19, Hellblade 1 and Hellblade 2. Now, speaking of single-player games, let's just go and talk about the Hellblade series. These are psychological thrillers that begs the question, what's real and what's not? You play as a character that's constantly questioning her own mental state. And honestly, I mean, it is a wild ride. The acting and the facial animations are honestly just some of the best that I've ever seen in gaming. The actress, Melina Juergens, is just brilliant in these games. And it's elevated even further by its excellent audio direction. Now, my only thing is, though, Hellblade 2 is a 30 FPS experience. Now, that's not necessarily ideal, but the fact that it's a slower-paced game does kind of help out with that. And, I mean, it really is just one of the best-looking games ever made from a graphical standpoint. Number 18, Octopath Traveler 2. Square Enix hasn't exactly always been Xbox's biggest supporter, but they're finally moving into a completely multi-platform direction, and that includes Octopath Traveler 2. This is a completely new, modernized JRPG that takes inspiration from Final Fantasy VI. And while I think the first game was good, I think its sequel, Octopath Traveler 2, is absolutely excellent. You have 8 different characters with their own motives and stories, and some will be better than others, but it becomes more of this cohesive experience the more you play it. It also has excellent turn-based combat, and I just think this is one of the better modern takes for JRPGs. An instant classic, easily. Number 17, Starfield. Well, I don't think Starfield necessarily lived up to its hype as being this generational defining game. I, however, still think that it's a good Bethesda RPG with a lot to offer. This is a massive game with 1,000 planets to explore, and with that, as you would expect, there's a ton of things to do. There's relationships, you can buy your own home, you can create your own spaceship, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Where I think this game really shines, though, is in its side missions. There's a lot of surprisingly deep side quests that are just as interesting as the main quest line. So I think to really enjoy Starfield, take your time. Don't necessarily rush through its story. Let the universe absorb you, and I think that if you do that, there's plenty to enjoy in its massive universe. Number 16, Dead Space. One of the greatest horror games ever made is officially back with a brand new remake, and it is better than ever before. Now, some people refer to it as Resident Evil in space, and you can definitely see some similarities between the two, but Dead Space is still really its own thing. It takes place on a space station, which is perfect for a claustrophobic environment, and that's something that really stands out about Dead Space. The tension is always a 10 out of 10 because of its close quarters, creepy setting. Where it really separates itself, though, is that unlike other zombie-based games, you don't specifically target their heads, but instead, you'll need to shoot off their limbs. There's a real strategy to this game as you manage its limited resources. The only thing that I have to say, though, is that please, EA, let's continue on with more Dead Space games. Make it happen. Number 15, Diablo 4. In some ways, Diablo 4 may have gotten off to a rocky launch with some up and down updates that not all fans necessarily adored. Over time, though, they've addressed most of those problems, and that continues on with its new expansion, Vessel of Hatred. Now, you can buy that as an extra, but even in the core Diablo 4 experience, it offers a ton of RPG mechanics that fans of the genre will really love. There's plenty of classes to choose from, and you can really fine-tune them the way that you want to as you progress throughout its campaign. It also has a strong story and a lot of in-game content. Then to just kind of top everything off, this is easily one of the better cooperative games that you can play this generation. Number 14, Doom Eternal. This very well might be one of the best designed first-person shooters ever made. This is not just your typical FPS. This is a game that brings back that fast-paced, thrilling action that we used to see in retro first-person shooters. It's got powerful and precise shooting, it's got platforming, it's intense, and what's just so amazing about all of this is its execution. It's not just a mindless shooter. There's a real strategy to Doom Eternal as you fight off an onslaught of demons. So id Software put together a retro, albeit modern classic, and if you like shooters, you absolutely need to play Doom Eternal. Number 13, Tunic. Now, this is a game that I had on my radar for years, and when I finally played it, it wasn't what I was expecting at all, and somehow, it was actually even better than what I had envisioned. At first glance, you might think that Tunic is just yet another Zelda clone, but that's really not what this game is. I mean, sure, yes, there are some Zelda inspirations here, but it's also a very Souls-like game. You have the whole bonfire system, and it's actually very challenging. Some of the bosses are legitimately difficult, and you have to be mindful in its combat. One thing is absolutely for sure, though, this is an amazing game with a perfectly crafted world. Number 12, Resident Evil. Now, there's actually a couple of Resident Evil games that you can play on Xbox Game Pass, including Resident Evil 2 and the Resident Evil 3 remakes. Both of these are all-time classic horror games brought to life in a modern way, and I mean, if there's any horror franchise that you absolutely need to play, these here are the games. To this day, Resident Evil 2 lives on as an absolute masterpiece, and it's why it's still praised as one of the best horror games ever made. It strikes this perfect blend of being scary, while also being fun in its combat and its puzzle elements. It also has a very rich story with great characters that further elevates the entire franchise. After you play Resident Evil 2, though, don't be all that surprised when you need to play the rest of the series. It's just that good. Number 11, It Takes Two. Now, this is legitimately one of the most special games that I've ever played. I mean, that's not an exaggeration at all. It Takes Two is flat out incredible. It might look like just another 3D platformer on the surface, but no, there's just so much more to this game. And part of what makes it just so special is that it's one of, if not the very best, cooperative game ever made. Now, it is a mandatory cooperative game, but you and your partner will always have to work together to solve puzzles and to help each other navigate through each stage. Now, I don't want to spoil any of its stages, but it really is a masterclass in creativity, and I'll just kind of leave it at that. It even has an interesting story that can be both funny, albeit deep at times. Number 10, the Yakuza series. Now, I honestly have no idea how Xbox pulled this off, but they somehow managed to make a deal with Sega to bring over a large portion of the Yakuza franchise. This includes 0 through 7, and I mean, that is an insane amount of content. But if you're new to the series, don't be intimidated. Most of these games aren't overly long, and what I can say is that these are without a doubt some of the best story-driven games that you'll ever play. They can go from goofy to serious to just downright emotional at times. They have just so many twists and turns along the way, and it just makes for an incredibly fun and wild ride. They're also very atmospheric, being located in Japan, and there's a lot to do from game to game. Now, most of the series has beat-em-up combat, except for the newer entries, which are instead turn-based. But if I could give you one recommendation, if you are new to this series, start off with Yakuza 0, which is the start of its story, and ironically, it's also one of the best in the entire franchise. Number 9, Stalker 2. Now, Stalker 2 went through one of the most unique and most turbulent development cycles that we've ever seen for a video game. And with that, it's not necessarily a perfect experience. Yes, it's got bugs and it's got issues, but despite that, it still managed to be a good game. It's a hardcore survival experience, and in some ways, it almost kind of reminds me of Fallout. You explore, scavenge the world for loot, and take on different quests from strangers. You can either help them, move on, or even betray them if you want. It kind of becomes your own story. But where it really separates itself is in its atmosphere. Stalker 2 has a very atmospheric world that almost completely absorbs you into its survival mechanics. Number 8, Persona 3 Reload. Now, speaking of Sega, they launched Persona 3 Reload into Xbox Game Pass day one. And what an amazing get. This is a top-tier JRPG and really just one of the all-time greats. It has a stylish art style and it combines turn-based combat, monster taming, and social sim elements into a single masterpiece. If you've never played any of these games though, basically you play as a high school student and you and a group of other students discover a parallel world that impacts the human world. So you have to kind of balance out your everyday life. You go to school, you build relationships and all of that, and then you also travel to this parallel demon world. And that's where it becomes more of a dungeon crawling JRPG. But no doubt about it, if you like this genre, then Persona 3 Reload is a must play. Number 7, Lies of P. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we've gotten a lot of Souls-like games over the years. But Lies of P very well might be the best attempt that we've seen from a company that's not From Software. For all of those people out there that's been begging for a Bloodborne update, well, here's your game. Lies of P was heavily inspired by the likes of Bloodborne, and you can see that in its world and in its combat. Even still, though, it's not a carbon copy. It's familiar, but it's also different with some fresh new ideas. And then also, surprisingly, it actually has a relatively interesting story based on Pinocchio. So, I mean, as long as you're up for a challenge and if you like Souls-likes, Lies of P is secretly one of the better games that you can play. Number 6, the Ori series and Hollow Knight. So, yes, I do have a combination of games here, and the reason for that is because they do have the same audience, and I do believe that they're equally as good, just in different ways. On the surface, they're both Metroidvania games, but they do focus on very different styles of gameplay. Hollow Knight is more of the Dark Souls of the Metroidvania genre, focusing more on its challenging combat. It's got a grim and dark world, whereas you have the Ori series, and they are just the complete opposite. They have a beautiful and vibrant world, but they do tell emotional stories, and they focus more on their challenging platforming. In fact, their platforming is just so good that I think it's actually better than most traditional 2D platformers as is, especially when you consider Ori's boss sequences. They'll truly put your skills to the test, but in both cases, whether it's Ori or Hollow Knight, these are among the very best Metroidvania games ever made, hands down. Number 5, Hi-Fi Rush. Now, this game was such a welcome surprise when it was first released. It's actually crazy that Xbox didn't care about this game more than they did because it's a one-of-a-kind game, and there's really nothing else quite like it. I mean, coming from somebody who's played games since the early 90s, there's not a lot of games that takes me by surprise anymore, but here you have Hi-Fi Rush. It's this rhythm-based action platformer, and everything in its world syncs up with its music. Its gameplay is unique, and it's just all so perfectly executed. It even has a fun story filled with charming characters. So if anything else here, I think Hi-Fi Rush is a pure joy to play. Number 4, Crash Bandicoot and Spyro Reignited. Again, I'm going to go with a combination of games here, in part because it allows me to actually talk about even more great games. But yeah, both of these are great mascot 3D platformers. You have the Crash Insane Trilogy, and these are very challenging and very unique 3D platformers. To this day, I've not played another platformer that plays quite like Crash Bandicoot and does as good of a job. It's easily an all-time great. And then you can also kind of say the same thing about Spyro Reignited. Instead, though, it's more of a traditional collectathon platformer. It's not quite as challenging as Crash Bandicoot, but boy, is it still good. And plus, I mean, you get to play as a dragon. Spyro is one of the coolest mascots around. Seriously, though, I mean, if you like this genre, these are must-play games, and technically this spot actually includes 7 games if you want to go and include Crash Team Racing as well, which is a very fun kart racer. Number 3, Call of Duty Black Ops 6. It is still just so hard to believe that Xbox now owns the Call of Duty franchise. Yet here we are, and they just launched Black Ops 6 into Xbox Game Pass on day 1. I mean, that is absolutely crazy that Game Pass has a game of this caliber, and they got it day 1. Also, I have to say, the newest entry is one of the best that we've seen in years. Not only does it have an addictive multiplayer component, as you would expect, but it also has a fun single-player mode. So it really just kind of offers the best of both worlds, which is kind of a rarity for modern-day games. There's not a lot of games that can offer both a good multiplayer and a good single-player at the same time. And again, the fact that this is even available in Game Pass in the first place is just mind-blowing. Number 2, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Now, this is a game that completely surprised me in the best possible way. This is a game that could have easily used the Uncharted or Tomb Raider formula, given that, they were inspired by none other than Indiana Jones himself, but they instead did their own thing with a first-person stealth experience. And that might be unexpected, but it's brilliant. It's one of the reasons that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle feels so refreshing in the AAA space. I mean, if anything else here, it's an authentic Indiana Jones experience that takes place after the first movie. And not only is the voice acting top-notch, but it also has an enjoyable story with mostly likable characters. So if you're an Indiana Jones fan, definitely check this game out. But even if you're not, the game itself is still good enough to maybe turn you into an Indiana Jones fan. You explore several large zones, you solve puzzles, you sneak around, and hey, if things get a little messy, you can always throw down with a little fisticuffs. This is definitely one of the most refreshing AAA games that I've played in a long, long time. And at the number 1 spot, I have none other than Psychonauts 2. Now, I've always viewed the first game as an all-time great collectathon 3D platformer, which, by the way, is also available on Xbox Game Pass. Go check it out. But not only did the sequel turn it up a notch, but it completely blew my expectations away. It's got quirky, lovable characters, it has tight platforming, the world is brilliantly designed, and it's also one of the most creative games that I've ever played. And to elevate it even further, it has a really good story. I mean, you don't usually think about storytelling when talking about collectathon 3D platformers, but Psychonauts 2, it's a really special game in that regard. It touches up on some mental issues, so it has some surprisingly serious beats to it, but it also knows how to keep things charming and fun at the same time. So from a gameplay standpoint, to its creativity, to its story, Psychonauts 2 is a truly, truly special game. Anyways, though, that's going to be it for this list. I hope that it helped you all find some great games. And if I missed one of your favorites, let me know about it in the comments below. That way other people can discover those as well. But with that said, make sure to subscribe for more content just like this, and peace out.